If you've lived in America for any longer than, let's say, 3 hours, you've heard people talking about rights. Rights-based rhetoric is everywhere, from podiums to pubs, courts of law to courts of basketball. People talk about gun rights, gay rights, rights of life, rights of choice. We have a right to free speech and a right to trial by jury, a right to vote and a right to protest. In short, whether you turn left or right, rights are there. But here's the question, one which, if you're like me, you may have never paused to think about. Namely, what exactly are people talking about when they're talking about rights? Thomas Jefferson, of course, said that certain rights are simply self-evident. Now, not to call old TJ wrong, but it isn't self-evident to me what someone means when they say they have a right. It isn't clear to me, for instance, what someone means when they claim that they have a right, self-evident right to health care. Does this mean that it is written somewhere in the heavens that everyone deserves health care? Or does it mean that the U.S. Constitution guarantees it? Or is saying that we have a right to health care just a way of saying that we really, really want it? I do not claim to be able to answer all these questions, neither those concerning health care nor those concerning rights in general. However, I do feel that Alan Gewirth and Alasdair MacIntyre, like a pair of woodsmen blazing trails in opposite directions, offer potential routes to the answers, and so it is to them that we will now turn. Alan Gewirth sets out to prove not only that rights exist, but that we can have a logically based idea of what these rights amount to. In order to do this, however, in order to prove that rights exist, we must first have some basic idea of what a right is. Just as it would be impossible for you to prove that Gila monsters exist without having any idea of what a Gila monster is, so too it would be impossible for Gewirth to prove that rights exist without first having some idea of what a right is. So then, Gewirth offers the following definition of a right. Rights, he claims, are personally oriented, normatively necessary moral requirements. Now, this definition is probably about as helpful to you as a waiter who brings you a fork for your soup. I therefore offer my own interpretation of Gewirth's definition, one which, if I have read him correctly, says about the same thing. Namely, rights are that which we necessarily owe ourselves and others in order to guarantee the possibility of morality. Now, you should notice something about this definition right away. Namely, on this definition, rights don't tell us anything about the good life or how to achieve it. Rights, in other words, don't tell us anything about what it means to be morally good or bad. Rather, rights are that which guarantee the possibility of being moral in the first place, protect the conditions of morality. So you might reasonably ask, how do they do this? Well, I'm glad you asked. If we want to know how rights protect the conditions of morality, we first need to know what the conditions of morality are, what it is that makes morality possible. In order to do this, Gewirth asks that we consider all the different kinds of morality: utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue ethics. We can even add so-called golden rule ethics and repugnant ethical systems such as Nazism. What, Gewirth asks us, must be possible if we are able to be good or bad according to any one of these systems? Simple. We must be able to form actions. If we can't act, no matter which system we're acting under, we can't do either the right or the wrong thing. We can't do anything. We can't be moral. So then what does action involve? Gewirth sees action as involving two things. First, action must be free. Action, or at least moral action, must be voluntary. We could not say, for instance, that a slave or a zombie are capable of truly doing anything, are capable of true action, because neither has freedom. Secondly, Gewirth proposes that all action is done for some purpose. By purpose here, you shouldn't be thinking anything as deep as the purpose-driven life or the real purpose of art, man. All Gewirth is trying to say is that when we do something, we always do it for the sake of, for the purpose of, something else. For instance, if we choose to lift weights on Friday, we do it for the sake of increasing muscle mass, or perhaps bumping into a certain someone at the gym. If we sign up for a college class, we do it for the purpose of getting a degree, or perhaps the simple purpose of furthering our education. Now then, at long last, Gewirth can finally begin figuring out how rights go about guaranteeing the conditions of morality. Remember that morality is only possible if we are able to act, and that in order to act, we must be free and be able to achieve a purpose. Therefore, if rights guarantee the possibility of morality, what rights must ultimately guarantee is our freedom and the possibility of achieving our purposes. Now, it's pretty clear what a right to freedom means. It simply means being free to act without interference from other people or from the government. However, it is far less clear what it means to have a right to the possibility of achieving our purposes. Gewirth thus proposes that we should think about this right as a right to well-being. Indeed, if we don't have a certain amount of well-being, if we don't have a certain amount of education, a certain amount of food and shelter, and so on, it is impossible that we could ever achieve the purposes towards which we act. For instance, we could never make it through college and get a degree if we didn't have access to food and water. Therefore, according to Gewirth, our rights boil down to this. If we are to be moral, then we must have the rights of freedom and well-being. This is Gewirth in a nutshell. In our second reading for today, Alasdair MacIntyre gives what is, to say the least, a rather different account of rights. Indeed, Gewirth and MacIntyre are opposed as yin and yang, as peanut butter and jelly, as the tropical rainforest and the Mojave Desert. Not only does MacIntyre offer an argument against Gewirth's defense of rights, he also argues that we should dismiss our belief in rights altogether. MacIntyre's piece begins in the manner of all good critiques, namely with a summary of the opposition. Even though I realize we did just go over this, I'll rehash Gewirth's argument one more time using MacIntyre's formulation, as it uses slightly different wording than my own. Must be that whole American-Scottish divide. I don't eat haggis, Scots don't go ice fishing, and neither of us lay out a philosophical argument in the same way. At any rate, here's MacIntyre's outline of Gewirth. In order to be capable of morality, one must be able to act. In order to act, one must have a certain amount of freedom and well-being. Therefore, in order to be moral, one necessarily needs freedom and well-being. Therefore, we have a right to freedom and well-being. Now, MacIntyre agrees with Gewirth's argument all the way up until the last claim. Indeed, he is more than convinced that Gewirth's arguments show that if we are to be moral, then we necessarily need freedom and well-being. What MacIntyre doubts is that because we need freedom and well-being, this means we have a right to freedom and well-being. This final conclusion, argues MacIntyre, makes necessarily needing something and having a right to something the same. But they aren't the same, and for at least two reasons. First, a need does not involve anyone owing anything, while a right does. Just think here about the difference between the right to free speech and the need for water. To say we have a right to free speech means that our fellow people in government owe it to us to let us speak our mind, while simply having a need for water does not imply that anyone owes us anything. Second, rights are dependent on a specific social context, while needs are not. Indeed, rights weren't even talked about until modern times, while needs have clearly always been around. This is why it makes sense to say that we have certain rights because we are Americans, but doesn't make sense to say we have needs because we are Americans. Therefore, concludes MacIntyre, Gewirth cannot assume that just because we necessarily need freedom and well-being, we have a right to them. Necessarily needing something and having a right to it, while similar in some ways, are actually very different things. Therefore, Gewirth's argument does not in fact prove that rights exist. But we may ask MacIntyre, if rights aren't needs, then what are they? His answer is that they are nothing, that they are fictions, complete figments of our imagination, on the same level as unicorns. Why should we believe this further claim? Well, says MacIntyre, we should believe it simply because of the fact that no one, Gewirth included, has ever conclusively proved the existence of rights. As such, rights simply get in the way of ethical thought. If it's not clear why rights would get in the way of ethical thought, think here about participating in a debate about animal treatment, in which someone keeps interjecting comments about unicorns. Sure, unicorns might exist, but unless we prove that they do, they really don't help us figure anything out about animal treatment. Rights, MacIntyre is trying to say, are a lot like unicorns in this regard. Sure, rights could exist, but until someone proves it, they're only going to get in the way of good ethical discussion. This, then, ends today's discussion of rights. I hope Gewirth and MacIntyre give you some ways of thinking about whether or not rights exist, and whether or not the concept of rights is helpful to ethical conversation. In the very least, I hope that today's presentation will cause you to think twice when you find yourself hearing or participating in a conversation in which rights take center stage.